So this is Newsline. Today is a recording. It's not live, okay? And but we're here, and as usual, we are broadcasting from the Newsfirst studios in Dawson Street, Colombo. And this morning we thought we'll try and explore further what's going on in the around the Swiss Alps. Not quite high up there, but certainly in Geneva. And to discuss the UN matter, we've got with us here a senior lecturer from the Law Academy of the University of Peradeniya, Dr. Kalina Senaratne. Very good morning to you, Kalina.
Good morning, Faraz.
And thank you very much for being on Newsline. What do you make up of what's going on? We've obviously got a change of government, and amongst their stated policies, to be fair, stated during the electoral period, they've said that they're not in agreement with the co-sponsorship and that they wish to withdraw. Foreign Minister Dinesh Gunawardena is in Switzerland, already told whoever it matters that Sri Lanka wishes to withdraw from the co-sponsorship. What does this all mean? Is it possible? What does it mean? So many questions. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think any government has the freedom to decide as to whether it wants to co-sponsor, continue with it or not. And I think the present government has decided that it's not going to do so.
Yeah.
Because the obligations arose due to the commitments made by the previous government. Is it possible? Well, I think logically it's anyway possible, because if one can co-sponsor, one can get out of it as well. The procedure is what would be of concern, because in my sense, my understanding is that it would not just happen. The state would have to firstly state, as it's going to do, that it's not going to co-sponsor, and then that would need to be legitimized through perhaps a counter-resolution, where the Human Rights Council takes on a resolution that is perhaps sponsored or written by us, or something that states that are going to support Sri Lanka have drafted, and then adopt that as the new resolution that is on the table. So I'm not sure as to how exactly that will happen, but just merely stating that it's not going to co-sponsor would amount only to a statement, and that would need to be finalized through perhaps a new resolution.
Would it be fair to say that the Sirisena Wickremesinghe combine in signing this or agreeing to co-sponsor, and indeed co-sponsoring, they gained time, the West and the others, agitating for this, and encouraging Sri Lanka, gently prodding them towards this well of transparency, accountability, and the whole shebang, encouraging towards that well. They've gained time. Two, would it be fair to say that they kind of sort of were acting rather too hopefully, because in agreeing to some of these conditions in the resolution, they would have to implement those, would have to change the constitution back home, and to change some of those things, included having a new, well, they'd need to have an amendment to the constitution anyway, for example, about the judges and so on. Do you think that that government, the Sirisena Wickremesinghe government, managed to sort of pull the wool over the international community, because they knew that they can promise, subject to Parliament in Sri Lanka passing some of these things, but they knew that politically it would be almost impossible?
Absolutely, yes. I think one thing that they want to do was to buy time. That was the first, perhaps, purpose of one of the first purposes of agreeing to co-sponsor this resolution. But even Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe would have known that this is not possible, because the Sri Lankan government, or no Sri Lankan government, I think, would be able to agree to a fully maybe a hybrid commission or anything of that nature.
It would be
So that was
political suicide, wouldn't it?
Political suicide, given the manner in which the majority understands the conflict and the nature of the conflict. So this was co-sponsoring that was without any commitment. Perhaps if there is one individual who was perhaps committed ideologically to what's stated in that particular resolution, that may have been Mr. Mangal Samarira. Other than that, I don't think there was anyone in the cabinet, anyone in parliament except for the TNA members who would have agreed with the contents, or at least certain paragraphs of that particular resolution which talked about.
But how could Minister Mangala Samarira agree to go and say these things without the backing of cabinet?
Well, legally, I do think there is a problem.
There's this issue of collective responsibility.
So it's not that Mr. Mangal Samarira could not have gone to Geneva and done what he did. Legally, it's fine, but politically, there's a huge problem, because he was making these commitments on behalf of a country, on behalf of government, and that's the ethical, moral concern.
Because by doing this, by going and agreeing to this and co-sponsoring it, what they've achieved, either by design or by omission, the fact is, what they've achieved is an overt admission that something terribly wrong happened, outside of due process, outside of international treaties, and so on, during the closing stages of the war. Because it sort of added fuel to the so-called panel of experts appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, although that report was never, ever authorized by the UN. In fact, it was after it was leaked by somebody, whether it was an inspirational leak or not, we don't know. It's not only in Sri Lanka that these little dodgy things happen. They happen all over the world, right? And then all of a sudden you find the UN human rights people sort of quoting off that. I mean, where on earth did Gordon Weiss get 40,000 people dead from? He must be nuts, because he doesn't source it. If he's writing a book, you need to source it. There's no source. By the same token, you got 40,000 dead. There's international rule of thumb that for every one dead, the field hospitals would have had to be treating around 13 people. For one dead, 13 treated. Well, 4 times 13 is what? 52. So there should have been 520,000 people treated in the field hospitals. There was nowhere near it. In fact, the Red Cross say about 7,000. That's close to the number of people treated. You're going to work backwards. So in between all this, how didn't Mr. Samarira realize what he is doing? Or did he realize and didn't care tuppence because he wanted to gain time?
Or maybe he believes that this really happened. Maybe that's his understanding.
Well, how? And where is the proof?
That's, he might have his own sources, he might want to believe in them.
But Dr. Kazan, let me ask you this. Time and time again, even in the last government, the question has been asked of various governments around the world. Some of them include Australasia, New Zealand, Australia, some countries in Asia, many countries in Europe, including the United Kingdom and including North America, Canada and United States. They've all been asked to provide figures of people who they've entertained as residents, as having fled from Sri Lanka and who've made new lives there. Those figures have never been shared with the government of Sri Lanka. So how on earth can you say, because we don't know whether 40,000 went by banana boat or any other boat. Right? So on the one side, they've got the information, they must have the information, and this side, they don't want to share it. So how can this figure of 40,000 promoted by Gordon Weiss has suddenly become received wisdom?
I think, I don't know how he sort of came to that particular conclusion, and I don't know whether it's a correct figure or not. My general sense has been that it was not as bad as it sort of sounds, and that I mean, the government forces did not intentionally target so many people. That has been my general sense. But I think in broad terms, the unintentional or intentional killing of certain civilians might have taken place because it was, after all, a brutal and a bloody war. But the concern, I mean, coming back to this issue of Geneva and then the resolution that was adopted in October 2015, what it actually does is to legitimize and endorse the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who basically comes up with this idea that the Sri Lankan forces violated international humanitarian law and human rights law. And that really is, I think, the concern for any government, because the government now has on paper admitted that it takes note of this particular report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and basically that it endorses it. And the specific words used, I think, that the government takes note appreciatively. So it basically endorses what the High Commission has said. So going forward, any government would have to take a stance, a clear stance on this particular issue. And the current government, I think, is basically saying that, well, we don't believe in the report, we don't believe in the accusation that have been leveled against.
But are they ready to investigate?
The present government?
Yeah.
I don't think they are ready. I don't think any government will be ready to investigate.
Any government?
Any government. Because after all, this conflict is not only about these figures, but underlying all of this is a strong Sinhala Buddhist nationalist sentiment, which is that the war that took place until 2009 was conflict with a terrorist organization, and during that battle, government forces could not have done much wrong. So that is the broad political understanding upon which all these debates are taking place. In such a context, no Sri Lankan government will be able to establish a fully blown inquiry, especially in a context where the Sri Lankan armed forces have won the war. And that generally does not happen in many states, where the winning side initiates an inquiry against its own forces.
But in many cases, you know, a victory by a democratically elected government of the day over terrorism and terror would be enough sort of for the whole world to stand up and celebrate, you know, celebrate the fact that bad has been drowned out by the good. Instead, that sort of positive sentiment only lasted maybe a few hours in the greater scheme of things, and instead Sri Lanka found itself at the wrong end of the whole appreciative business, and now they find themselves even being accused of genocide, and that's pretty serious. So how do we erase that from our reputation?
Well, the world, I think, stood up and did celebrate the victory of the Sri Lankan Armed Forces. And one needs to go back to the 2009 resolution that was adopted in the Human Rights Council, because that is, I mean, one made of candy floss. If you go through the paragraphs once again, I mean, it's unimaginable that the Human Rights Council, that is the same Human Rights Council, basically adopted that kind of resolution. What does that say? It says, well, Sri Lanka, it appreciates the fact that the war has ended, it appreciates the fact that the LTT has been defeated, and then it sets out a few things, resettlement, rehabilitation, a few things of that nature, non-discrimination, the importance of having a state policy based on non-discrimination, human rights protection, and then the only thing that that particular resolution asks the government to do is to initiate a political dialogue to reach a political settlement of the conflict. So that was how a majority of the world basically responded to the Sri Lankan situation. How did we get to 2015? It's largely because of the policies of the state.
I see. I think we've got several minutes left now, but I want to ask you how. So there's a process to withdraw from this. There's a process. What do you think is going to be the fallout of withdrawing from this core sponsorship?
I'm not sure whether there would be an immediate fallout. I mean, obviously, the West in particular would be a bit worried. They would take this as another instance when the Sri Lankan government goes against its wishes. But that can be paid off with the assistance of the other countries.
Yeah.
So if India and the regional powers and other countries are with you, that shouldn't be a significant problem. What matters is what the government would do ultimately with regard to this particular problem and the broader problem of this Sinhala Tamil ethnic conflict that has been in Sri Lanka for so many years.
I see. Because I want to ask you this, Dr. Karna Senratne. Journalists, not only in Sri Lanka but all over the world, in the region and all over the world, have spent many hours and have occupied hundreds and perhaps even thousands of centimeter columns of newsprint and lots of data on the internet, and radio and television stations have used up airtime talking and talking and talking and discussing and debating the various issues that have happened. But in the meantime, while all this talking is happening, there's hardly any action. And by that I mean that the people who've been affected by these tragedies, by the series of tragic events, are still left virtually destitute. They are in their threadbare clothes, in makeshift homes, without the basic implements of life per se, like a roof over your head, electricity, water, education. These are all challenges that they are still living 11 years after the end of the so-called war and 41 years after it started or more. This is, 41, you just imagine that. 41 years. There is no action. What should we do? Can we move on? Can't we move on? What do we need to do to move on?
Well, I think this is the point that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa had been raising. There have been so many promises made to the Tamil people. Nothing has happened, especially on this issue of devolution. So in moving on, I mean, there are so many things that can be done. One immediate thing that can be done, of course, is for the President and the government to take a serious look at what the problems are in the north and then go and address them. He has been visiting so many places. Why not Jaffna? Why not Kilnochi? Why not these places? So that's one. But there would need to be a broader settlement to this particular issue that comes firstly from the Sri Lankan Sinhalese side in the form of a political solution or in the form of some solution that is acceptable both to the Sinhala people as well as the people who were largely victimized, the Tamil people. So that is perhaps the only way out, and that political solution is not just a solution that is based on devolution, but also on various other matters like independent institutions, human rights protection, greater mechanisms, and economic and social development of the people.
Does the future look bright? Does it look subdued?
Yeah, the safest thing to say is that it's uncertain. But let's see, there's a new leadership, and I think if there is one person that can be trusted within this political sort of setup, that person to me is the current president, because I think he has not been a politician. He's new to politics, but he's also someone who I think who has shown during the past few months that he means business. So if he takes a serious approach to this particular problem as well, there might be some progress.
It's also fair to say that there were a lot of people who were fearful of our dear president in his role as the defense secretary.
We were fearful. Was it? We were fearful.
There were people who
were
were
fearful. Yes.
Do you think, has he done anything to dispel those fears?
Well, I think he has perhaps shown to some that that he is not the defense secretary that we saw in 2006, 2015. And he perhaps understands, or he ought to understand, that he's the president of the country, he's the president of all the people. So perhaps we are seeing a different person, or maybe, I mean, I sometimes think whether our characterization of Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa during that period was also based on certain misunderstandings, whether this was the same person. But it's just that we didn't see him openly in public places doing what he's doing now.
That's the power of the media. If
You've
got to engage the media.
Yes.
You can't be hiding your head in the sand.
But there is, I think, a shift in approach. I mean, in the way in which certain people look at this particular problem. The best example is Mr. Kamal Gujrat's statement recently about the November commemoration that takes place in the north, where he came up with this idea that, well, it's partly a commemoration is partly about the rights of the Tamil people, so therefore the government would not take an extremist approach about it. So I think people realize that when they are in power, when they're doing the business of governing, that things are not so easy. One needs to be flexible, open about these matters.
One has to be politically pragmatic.
One has to be, yes.
And last and final question. Do you think that President Nandasena Gotabaya Rajapaksa will be permitted by his cabinet of ministers to continue what he wants done in terms of accountability, responsibility, because this president doesn't seem to be the talking type. I don't think that in the first 100 days he's given a one-on-one interview. We have certainly bid, I have bid for that, but I'm told it is not ready yet.
Well, it depends on what the politicians will get and not get, maybe in the coming few months. Because if there's anyone that can bring down Mr. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, that would be not an external force, but forces within the same setup. So he would need to be mindful of the political characters who are surrounding him, perhaps.
You think that it's full of landmines?
Full of landmines. Full of landmines.
Does he really need the help of international partners to demine them?
Well, not really, because international partners might also have different ideas about.
They might also do some mining.
So, yes.
Last question then. Would it be fair to say that the times ahead are interesting?
Very interesting.
The times ahead, will it mean at least a slight alleviation of the poverty and hardship being faced by these people who've been affected by the war?
I think that's President Rajapaksa's main goal. So, and his record will be tested on that particular issue, not on any other aspect such as devolution of power and so on. So he'll be, I think, taking that particular challenge quite seriously. And if there isn't the slightest sort of upward movement on that front, that would mean that he has ended up as a failure. So he wouldn't anymore that particularly.
I don't think failure is in his vocabulary. Well, Dr. Khalid Senaratne, senior lecturer, the Law Academy, University of Peradeniya. Thank you very much for being on Newsline. We really appreciate your presence. And that's the way it was on Newsline. Take care. Have a great day ahead of you. And of course, God bless.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.